Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday the 25th of May. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and your host this week. Coming up on the show, will Ukraine's counteroffensive push back Russia? What is in President Zelensky's plan, and has the attack already begun? Mark Galeotti and Mike Martin will join me. Yesterday, Ron DeSantis announced that he would be running for president. What would American support for Ukraine look like under a Republican commander-in-chief? I'll speak to Freddy Gray and John Mearsheimer. In Westminster, Suella Braverman is in trouble for a speeding ticket, and Boris Johnson is back in the news over partygate. Does it matter? Katy Balls will join me. New figures this week show that the inflation rate in the year leading up to April fell, but core inflation rose. What does that mean, and when will the price pinch stop? I'll ask Michael Simmons. And finally, the Spectator's low-life columnist Jeremy Clarke has sadly passed away. Rod Liddle will join me to discuss their friendship. Before we get going, thanks to our brilliant sponsors, Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management, for sponsoring the show. Canaccord are experienced wealth planners and investment managers who offer unwavering support in challenging times. Visit candowealth.com for more information. And if you enjoy Spectator TV, then do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure that you never miss an episode.
The best things in life are free, but only for a month. If you subscribe to The Spectator today, you'll not only get your first month free, but after your trial, you'll pay just £1 a week for full access to our website and app, or £2 a week if you want the print magazine too. To claim this offer, go to spectator.co.uk/best.
First up, Mark Galeotti, a security expert and director of Mayak Intelligence, writes about Ukraine's next move for this week's cover piece. After so much talk of a counteroffensive, Zelensky, Mark says, cannot afford to play it safe. To discuss, Mark joins me now alongside Mike Martin, author of How to Fight a War. Thank you for joining us, Mark and Mike. Mark, for the Spectator magazine this week, you write about an upsurge in what the Ukrainians describe as shaping operations, preparing the ground for battle with attacks on Russian fuel and weapons depots and command centers. Tell us more about the situation.
Well, we're in this situation in which, look, we know that the Ukrainians they must launch a counteroffensive, and they've said so themselves. Of course, the thing is that there's often this misconception that a counteroffensive means some massive hammer blow attack, whereas actually it can be a whole series of pulsing operations that build up. And in this case, what we're seeing is certainly the Ukrainians are at present involved in, as you said, a variety of operations to do several things. One is put stress on the Russian supply lines. That's always one of the key points of potential failure in very voracious modern warfare. Two is to keep the Russians guessing, hopefully getting them to move forces around to reinforce areas that actually don't need to be reinforced. And thirdly, just generally to put psychological pressure on the Kremlin. Putin does not tend to make good decisions when he's under stress. He tends to dither or overcompensate. And I think the Ukrainians are aware of that, and therefore are hoping that, given the degree to which he's micromanaging the war effort, to make him commit some blunders.
Ukraine has just invaded the Belgorod region in Russia. What's behind this?
Well, of course, the Ukrainians say that it's nothing to do with them. It just happened to be good, solid Russian patriots who are there to establish a security zone around the border. Now, of course, that is a convenient fiction. These Russian units, which are fighting on behalf of the Kiev regime, they operate entirely within the structures of the Ukrainian armed forces, and they're essentially controlled by Ukrainian military intelligence. I think the idea is to do several things. First of all, just simply to embarrass the Kremlin. And if you look at, for example, the sort of turbo patriot nationalist Twitter feed, social media feeds in Russia, I mean, there are a lot of people saying, what the hell is going on? Why can these people just simply stroll across the border, shoot up some border posts and police stations, and then stroll out? So it is generating real trouble inside Russia's political elite. But beyond that, it's precisely an attempt to essentially force the Russians to have to transfer troops. They have a long border with Ukraine, a border that, frankly, at the moment is very hard to defend. But nonetheless, it may be that for political reasons, they're going to have to do something to show that they're taking this seriously, move some units to these border areas, units that otherwise would be sitting in trenches ready to repel any Ukrainian attack.
Mike, what's your take? How worried should the Russians be? Are the Ukrainians setting a trap to lure them in?
I'd agree with everything that Mark said. I think the psychology is absolutely central to this. And, in addition to Putin's command style and micromanaging, you've got to add to that a Russian military structure that is really hierarchical, really slow at making decisions. Everything has to be referred all the way up and all the way back down again. And just to look at this raid, really, which is what it was in Belgrade. It wasn't an invasion in the sense of holding territory. They were just going across the border to have a sort of a smash and grab. And to put that in numbers, it's really, really good operational art, because what it's done is the border, the front line between Russian and Ukrainian troops was about 1,200 kilometers within Ukraine, right, stretching from the far northeast down to the southwest in Kherson, with that arc that we're also familiar with from the TV news. But if suddenly the Russian-Ukrainian border comes into play, that's all that bit, to the northeast from Kharkiv, stretching right round to the border with Belarus, that's about another 1,200 kilometers. So what the Ukrainians have done is they've doubled the length of the potential front line. And that does what all strategy seeks to do, which is to create dilemmas for your opponent. And the dilemma here is, as Mark said, where do we put our troops? And of course, if you disperse troops, that opens up opportunities for your enemies. So if the Russians have to disperse their troops across a front line that's twice as long, the Ukrainians have lots of options, and they've taken advantage of this before. If your viewers remember the really, really fast Ukrainian advance into Kharkiv in September 2022, that was as a result of the Russians thinning out troops from that region and taking them down into the south to defend Kherson, which the Ukrainians were pushing on. And it really just reinforces the problem that the Russians have had right from the start, which is that they've bitten off much more than they can chew, and they don't have enough troops to achieve the goals, the strategic and political goals that they've set themselves. And so the Ukrainians are just taking advantage of that.
Mark, Russia says that they've taken control of Bakhmut. Is this a tactical loss for Ukraine or not?
I think it's more than anything else a political loss of sorts, but really this has been one of the most Pyrrhic victories of this war. The Russians essentially decided that Bakhmut mattered, and it mattered for political reasons, not least because Yevgeny Prigozhin, the man behind the Wagner mercenary organization, desperately wanted to give the boss a trophy. And in fact, part of the reason why he's become so outspoken in his criticism of the Ministry of Defense and claiming that they're strangling his troops of ammunition and letting them down and running away and everything else is in some ways he's trying to pass the buck, because he clearly had overpromised. He had promised Putin a victory before Victory Day, the 9th of May, and he wasn't able to basically deliver. And so to this end, because it was important to the boss, the Russians have had to throw more and more troops in. And some of these were very, very poor quality, mercenaries who were recruited from the Russian labor camp system. If nothing else, this war has done wonders for Russian prison overcrowding. But these were good troops in some cases. I mean, they have actually had to sort of throw in, for example, paratroopers as well as Wagner's own more experienced officers. So all of this for a city which, sure, people can draw lines on a map and say, aha, it unlocks an offensive in this direction or that. But it's clear that the Russians do not at the moment, and won't for some time, have any significant offensive capability. They're not going to be able to launch another big offensive. Quite the opposite. They're now essentially hunkered down in defensive mode. So from the Ukrainians' point of view, this was an opportunity to bleed the Russians, to force them to concentrate, what capabilities they had on a city that didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Admittedly, the Ukrainians have also taken losses. I mean, there was a degree to which this simply became a grudge match between Kyiv and Moscow. And arguably, the Ukrainians hung on longer than they really should. But either way, they have basically held up all of Russia's potential offensive capabilities all the way through the spring, fighting for a city that frankly does not really matter. Putin will claim it as a victory. Fine. Well, may he enjoy his laurel wreath. But no one, I think, is seriously regarding this as an advance.
Mike, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, is it the 56th biggest settlement in Ukraine or something? I think if you zoom out, this pattern fits very much into the Bakhmut fits into the pattern of the war, and largely that is that Russia decides that it wants to take a particular place. Ukraine realizes that and then uses that battle to bleed them whilst this is building up resources for a strike somewhere else. So we saw it in Mariupol, right, which was eventually the Russians were going to take that city. They razed it to the ground. We had all the steelworks, right at the beginning of the war. But the Ukrainians knew that if they got the Russians to focus on that, that would enable them to buy time and space elsewhere. It happened in Severodonetsk over last summer, where it was clear that they were probably going to have to pull out, but they did it as slowly as possible to bleed the Russians as much as possible whilst they were preparing their offensive to go south into Kherson. And now Bakhmut is the latest version of this. The Russians settle on somewhere and the Ukrainians allow them to do that and then really, really, really drain them of materiel and men and all the rest of it whilst they are preparing something else, which we're now seeing the start of. They are now, momentum is very clearly past the Ukrainians now, and they're stepping off.
Mike, in Mark's piece, he also says that U.S. officials want what they call a return on investment to its Western backers. The goal would therefore be to achieve some concrete and politically powerful objective measured in terms of territorial gains. What will they want?
I think there has been a realization that the war either needs to be settled in 2023 or needs to be moved into a different tipping point. And the reason for that is because of the US presidential election next year. And as we can see from some of the characters that are lining themselves up to be in that fight, it's not clear that US support for Ukraine would continue at the same level if it becomes a political football in the presidential race. And so that, everyone's realised that, which is why we saw this massive inflow of equipment, at the beginning of the year, all the tanks coming in January. In terms of return on investment, I suspect, sadly, that Mark is right, that there are many politicians who do view war as a bit of a spreadsheet, where, you put these inputs in and you get the following out. I think war is much more of a conversation, and it's much more psychological. I think that at a minimum, there must be some sort of spectacular. So, Crimea being put under siege, which Mark mentioned in his piece, or cutting through the Russian lines and splitting their forces into two by driving south from Zaporizhia to reach the Sea of Azov, or something like that. Such that it changes the decision-making calculus in Moscow, because effectively, at the moment, both sides have mutually incompatible claims. So there's no grounds for any kind of peace talks at the moment. But a shifting of the dial, a significant changing of the landscape in Ukraine, might open up a landing zone for a negotiated settlement. It's not clear that whether that will be possible with Putin. And so that's the big question is, does failure on the battlefield in Ukraine, can Putin outlive that? And if not, then who comes next? Those to me seems the sort of unknowns at the moment.
Mark, is there likely to be more offensives and counteroffensives after this one?
Well, sadly, I don't think this war is going to end this year. So absolutely, just a question of whether it's this year's or next year's run of campaign seasons. The thing is that, again, I mean, I like Mike's characterization of war as a conversation. I mean, again, it's essentially how long can the Ukrainians monologue before the Russians get a word in edgewise? And in that context, so much depends on this imponderable of precisely what form the offensive takes. And the Ukrainians have been understandably extremely cagey about what and when, frankly, to a large extent, even behind closed doors with their allies. And so we will have to see. The Russians, though, their forces are still powerful, but brittle, I would suggest. And again, it's the capacity to actually convert. If you manage to stop the Ukrainian offensive and hold them, can you then convert that into a rollback? And I think that's going to be a lot harder for them to do. I think really before the Russians are going to be able to launch another offensive, they're going to have to find more troops. And that means either Putin biting the bullet and deploying conscripts, which would be politically massively unpopular at home, but it means it would allow him to tap up to 180,000 troops who in some cases are actually better equipped and trained than the mobilized reservists currently in theatre. Or he'd have to launch another mobilization wave. Again, massively unpopular. Last time he did it, more Russians fled the country than actually got signed up into the military. So, these are really difficult things. So I think basically from the Russians' point of view, they will just simply try and hunker down. They feel time is on their side, that the longer they can make this war last, the more chance there is of the Western alliance beginning to fragment, Western will to pour billions of pounds, dollars and euros into Ukraine every month will begin to reduce. So, in that context, I think they will regard not losing as in some ways a win.
Mark and Mike, thanks very much for joining me. Ron DeSantis yesterday announced his candidacy to be the Republican nominee for President of the United States. So far, he's the most serious challenger to Donald Trump in the upcoming primaries. How would a Republican president change America's support in Ukraine? Freddy Gray writes about it in this week's magazine, and he joins me now alongside John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago. John and Freddy, thanks for joining me. Freddy, you write for the magazine this week about how having a Republican president could change America's position on Ukraine. Under Joe Biden, the U.S. has spent more than $70 billion helping Ukraine. How would a Republican president, and I think more specifically in this piece, a Trump president, change that?
Well, I think Trump's made it very clear what he intends to do. He said that he says three things about it. He says, first of all, if he were president, Putin never would have invaded Ukraine. It's impossible to say whether that's true or not. Secondly, he says Europe's not paying enough. America's paying far more than Europe to the war effort, and he'd make the Europeans pay more. And thirdly, he says he would resolve the conflict within 24 hours, within a day of entering the White House. And I think what's quite interesting about this is a lot of hawks on the British side, on the NATO side, and in America on the Republican, hawkish side of the Republican Party, worry that he actually might do that. But to their mind, that would mean making concessions to Russia, rewarding Putin's aggression, as they put it, which would then encourage Putin to be even more aggressive in the future, possibly with other states, the Baltics and so on. Mm. And I thought it was interesting, very telling this week, that Boris Johnson, who's now become a sort of global cheerleader for the war effort, went to Texas to talk to some rich Texas Republicans and some politicians, and to sort of gee them up, to say that you are still backing the right horse. Ukraine's going to win this fight. There's going to be a magnificent counterpunch this summer, and the Russian military will collapse. I suspect a lot of people at lunch believed him. He makes the case very forcefully. The difficulty for the Republican Party is that a lot of their voters, and the polls show this, a lot of their voters are not aligned with that position on Ukraine. And as this election approaches, that's going to come into sharper focus.
Fred, you mentioned there that Trump says things like, if I had been president, Russia would have never invaded. On comments like that, comments that he can end this war in 24 hours, do you think the public buy it?
Well, I think that points towards a golden rule of Republican campaign dynamics now, which is that Trump can say anything and get away with it, and other candidates can't. Right. For instance, Ron DeSantis recently, a few weeks ago, found himself sort of boxed in on the question of Russia, because I think by instinct he's more of a conventional hawk, more of an Atlanticist. But he was pressed by the now sacked Fox News host Tucker Carlson to say, what is America's national interest in fighting Russia on Ukraine, or being involved in the war in Ukraine? And he replied, he said, it's not a vital national security interest for America to be further entangled in Ukraine. And he was much criticised for that in the media, and it didn't result in the Republican base rallying towards him. In fact, if anything, I'm sure there were lots of other factors involved. If anything, his polling has declined since he made that statement. Mm. But Trump can say, I'll resolve it in 24 hours, and he gets away with it, because nobody sort of asks him the further questions in the interview. Even on CNN, a hostile interviewer only wanted to ask him, do you want Ukraine to win? And he said, I just want people to stop dying. And the crowd in New Hampshire broke into an ovation. The more sensible question, I think, to ask him would be, how exactly are you going to do that?
Right. Indeed. We'll come back to Florida's governor. He's had a big week. But John, I want to bring you in. You're, of course, known for saying that NATO should take some of the blame for what's happening in Ukraine. But let's pivot specifically to the Republican Party position here. What is the mainstream Republican opinion about Ukraine? And how big is this issue going to be, the issue of the war, in the 2024 election?
I think you have to distinguish between the elites and the public. And it's very important to understand that what the public thinks here in the United States just doesn't matter very much. The elites just do what they please. There's no question that there are a lot of doubters in the public, both on the Republican side and on the Democratic side. And it's likely that the number of doubters will grow with time. But the question is, how's that going to affect the elite? And the argument that's being made is that the Republicans are beginning to go soft on Ukraine at the elite level, and that if Donald Trump gets elected, there's a really good chance that he'll pull the plug on the Ukrainians. This is not going to happen, in my opinion. The United States is backing Ukraine to the hilt. And if the United States withdraws its support for Ukraine, its material support, Ukraine is going to collapse. It can't stand up to the Russians. The Russians would win a big victory. It's hard for me to imagine that any American leader, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, is going to allow that to happen. It's just not going to happen. We are too deeply committed to this war. There's too much Russophobia in the United States. There's too much talk about the fact that this is an existential threat that we're facing with Russia for us to cut and run and allow Ukraine to go under. Furthermore, just think about what the consequences will be for China. Our credibility, people will argue, will be destroyed if we allow Ukraine to lose. So I think Trump talks a good game. But what he actually does when he's in office, assuming he gets reelected in 2024, is another matter. And I would note here, just as a final point, that Donald Trump, when he ran for president and in his initial few months in the White House, said that he wanted to improve relations with Russia. He viewed Putin as a friend. He wanted to put an end to NATO and get out of Europe. None of that happened. And in fact, what did happen is that in 2017, it was Trump who started arming the Ukrainians. Obama, much to his credit, had the good sense not to arm the Ukrainians. But Trump decided to arm the Ukrainians, and we were as tough on the Russians during the Trump administration as we were in any other administration. So Donald Trump can talk all he wants about how he's going to do a 180-degree turn regarding American policy on Ukraine. But in my opinion, that's not going to happen if he gets reelected.
You mentioned there that you think more fatigue will set in when it comes to the war in terms of American opinions of it. South Carolina Senator Tim Scott has just launched his presidential campaign with a very different view. He thinks that Joe Biden has not done a great job of explaining to the American people why the interventions have been so substantial in Ukraine, but that there is a case to be made. If you look at polling numbers in the states right now, there's certainly increasing debate between Americans about just how long the U.S. should be supporting Ukraine, a debate between, say, 1 to 2 years and then indefinitely. But there does still seem to be a lot of support, a majority of support for helping Ukraine.
There's no question about that. And it's hardly surprising. If you look at how we talk about Russia in the United States and in the West more generally these days, Vladimir Putin is portrayed as the devil incarnate. There's extreme Russophobia in the land. And the Biden administration and the establishment, foreign policy establishments in the West more generally, have done a brilliant job of propagandizing this war. So it's unsurprising that large chunks of the body politic in all these Western countries are committed to seeing Russia defeated.
Do you think it's propaganda that's convinced the American people that they should support Ukraine, or is it the fact that they watch Vladimir Putin march his tanks over the border into Ukraine?
No, it's clearly the propaganda campaign. It's truly amazing the extent to which our discourse here in the West is limited, so that we end up supporting the Ukrainians at every turn and opposing the Russians at every turn. There's hardly anything that's ever said that's positive about the Russian effort, or that's a possible explanation in Russia's favor for why this war happened. This is a truly outstanding case of extreme propaganda. The only case that I think comes close is what happened in both Britain and in the United States during World War I. You want to remember that in World War I, there was no equivalent of Pearl Harbor or 9/11 that brought us into the war. And as a result, Woodrow Wilson had to go to great lengths to mobilize the American public to back the war. And this was especially true because the two biggest ethnic groups in the United States at that point in time were German Americans and Irish Americans. And Wilson was deeply fearful that the German Americans would not fight against Germany and the Irish Americans would not fight with Britain. So we launched an amazing propaganda campaign. And I think that since then, there has been no equivalent to that propaganda campaign until recently when Russia invaded Ukraine. And we have gone to great lengths to portray the Russians in the most negative light and to silence people who might have a somewhat different view. And that would include someone like me, of course.
Freddie, Trump used to get a lot of criticism when he would go and shake hands with these dictators and human rights abusers. And his argument would be, well, look at the results. Don't look at the handshake, look at the results. I am moving America away from this heavy interventionist foreign policy. And he would claim he was successful. Indeed, I think he certainly moved the Democrat Party into a more isolationist point of view. Do you think one of the reasons he's so hesitant to say how he would actually do what he's pledging to do, to bring the war to an end in 24 hours, is because those handshakes would not be feasible now? He would not be able to buddy up to Vladimir Putin in the same way. He would have to take a more hostile approach. And frankly, that could lead to results that could lead to very different results than what the president is promising.
I'm not sure. I think Trump's approach is always the sort of real estate approach to foreign policy, which is, you make deals, you take positions, you deceive people with your positions if you have to. And I think where Trump is effective as a campaigner is that he often says things that Americans think, but no one in the public eye or no one in the elites, if you like, will say. So there's a famous moment when he was asked about foreign authoritarian governments doing terrible things, and he said, do you think we're so innocent? And this was taken as a sort of very anti-American statement, but actually I think a lot of Americans know that their government has done terrible things in the world, and they're quite honest about that. So I think he has a rhetorical ability with it. His deal-making ability as a statesman is, I think, as John suggests, much exaggerated. But the fact that he would be willing to talk to Vladimir Putin and is willing to say that he would be willing to talk to Vladimir Putin does make him a different type of politician to a lot of the other candidates.
Freddie, this week, Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis has launched his presidential campaign on Twitter. And if anyone's going to be a challenger to Trump, it is thought at the moment anyway that Ron DeSantis will be that person. Even if we just break this down into name recognition, some of the other candidates running don't come close. Would his policy towards Ukraine be much different from Donald Trump's?
Well, his recent statements on it suggest that no, it wouldn't. But he'd certainly talk about it more in the language of international statesmanship. He wouldn't be saying, I'll just make a deal with Putin, and because I know his strengths and weaknesses, and I know Zelensky's strengths and weaknesses, and so I'll fix it. He'll talk more about international interests and the national interest. And I think so far it looks as though he knows that the conservative base that he wants to rally are much more sceptical about what America's doing in Ukraine than the rest of the population. And so I think for now he's tilting towards Trump. Tim Scott, on the other hand, is tilting towards the more hawkish position and talking about, it being a national interest to degrade Russia's military so that it can avoid an attack on UK sovereign land. I think that's an odd position, and I think a lot of Americans will think it's an odd position because they'll think, well, how is Russia really threatening American sovereignty? And is not the war that is currently being conducted increasing the likelihood of the only feasible, albeit unthinkable, attack on America from Russia, which is a nuclear one, which of course would be the end of the world?
John,
could I quickly just respond to something that Freddie said? I think he's exactly right that Trump views himself as a deal maker, and he thinks that he can move in here and he can talk to Putin, he can talk to Zelensky, he can use pressure on Zelensky, and he can cut a deal. The problem that Trump faces is not simply that there would be resistance from the rest of the establishment if he tried to do that. The real problem is there's no deal to be had here, right? Nobody can figure out what the solution is to shutting this conflict down. And there are two reasons for that. One is the territorial issue. The Russians are not going to give back the territory they've conquered, and the Ukrainians want that territory back, and you can't square that circle. Furthermore, the Russians want Ukraine to be a neutral state, and Ukraine wants a security guarantee, and that can only come from the West, and you can't square that circle. So there is no deal to be had. So, there's all this talk these days about using the Chinese as a force or as a moderator to work out some sort of deal. That's not a viable argument because, again, it has nothing to do with the Chinese. It's the fact that there's no deal to be had. So Trump can talk till he's blue in the face about cutting a deal, but there's no deal to be had.
But he would, and John, obviously you're the great expert on international relations, so I defer to you on this, but he would have leverage. I mean, Americans' power is unrivaled. He would have significant leverage over Ukraine because of the support that America has provided Ukraine, and he would have significant leverage over Russia because of the threat that America can pose to Russia and the fact that the war has not been going according to Russia's plan so far.
I think you're absolutely right that he would have significant leverage over the Ukrainians. Not total leverage, but significant leverage. But I don't believe he'd have any leverage over the Russians. The Russians don't trust the Americans, whether it's Trump or Biden, as far as they can throw them. And the Russians have a deep-seated interest in taking as much of Ukraine as they can and turning the remaining part of Ukraine into a dysfunctional rump state. And promises from Donald Trump that they'll work out some sort of meaningful deal and therefore the Russians can make concessions is not going to wash. The Russians no longer trust us, and they shouldn't trust us.
There's also a question about what would happen to President Zelensky if he did come to the table and walked away with a deal that your average Ukrainian did not think was acceptable. They could well oust him and bring in somebody else. It strikes me that there's no guarantee that either side, frankly, would necessarily declare this war over, even if President Trump did.
I agree with that. And I think it's not your average Ukrainian, it's the ultra-right in Ukraine. There has long been a powerful ultra-right, a nationalist right in Ukraine that wants to make no concessions to the Russians and is heavily into de-Russification of Ukraine. And those people would be very hard to get on board. And Zelensky's had his problems since he was elected dealing with those people. So I agree completely with what you say.
Your average Ukrainian, of course, has also been out there fighting. I mean, clearly there is still support amongst the country for trying to defend what they want to keep. But Freddie, my last question to you is, if Trump were to become president and he were to implement his agenda, I think we've established a lot of question marks over that agenda, what would other Western countries be able to do? Would they be able to keep supporting Ukraine? Would they be able to do this without the United States?
I mean, I think a second Trump presidency would be a graver threat to NATO than the first presidency was. There was a lot of, sort of fear about NATO Trump was going to tear NATO apart and so on, because he didn't really see the point of it. In his first term, he just was agitating for other states to contribute more money. He didn't want America to pay so much. I think in a second term, with this situation in Ukraine, with all the pressures going on, I think it would be a graver threat to NATO. I don't make any moral judgments whether that's a good or bad thing. I just think that would be the dynamic.
Freddy and John, thanks for joining me on Spectator TV. In Westminster this week, Home Secretary Suella Braverman has been in trouble over a speeding ticket and allegations that she broke the ministerial code. And Boris Johnson has been referred to the police over allegations that he broke lockdown rules with gatherings at Chequers. To tell us about it and to discuss her politics column this week, Katy Balls joins me now. Katy, probably the biggest political story this week is that the net migration figures have surged. And in your column for the magazine, you write about how this is politically tricky for Rishi Sunak. Talk us through it.
Yes, there's lots of Westminster intrigue this week, which I'm sure we'll go into, but I think by far the biggest story in terms of what the Tories are trying to do in government and in terms of the next election relates to immigration. Now, as you say, new figures out which show that the number in terms of legal migration has ballooned. Now, we knew that this was coming, partly because the Home Secretary gave a speech last week, which was really in anticipation of this, talking about the need to control immigration, the need to retrain workers in the UK, so you no longer have to rely so much on cheap labour from abroad. And it was a speech which was technically sanctioned by Number 10, but I don't think was something that they would have designed of their own accord. And then this week, I think, to try and get the front foot over these figures, announced new measures in terms of cracking down on visas for dependents for certain types of students. And this could have quite a significant impact. Over 100,000 last year came in through this route. But the timing, I think it means that it's the question about how quickly it really kicks in due to the academic year. So you might not really see anything till next year in terms of the impact it could have. Now, are we expecting Rishi Sunak to go much further? It's interesting that even Labour are saying net migration is too high. You have Keir Starmer going on at Prime Minister's Questions. It used to be a tricky spot for Labour. They clearly now feel confident enough they can go after the Conservative Party's record. Yet it doesn't feel for now that the Tories will announce much more in terms of a crackdown. Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, has raised other ideas behind the scenes, such as raising the minimum threshold in terms of salaries. But ultimately, I don't think Rishi Sunak wants to go that much further on this, because you have Jeremy Hunt in the Treasury, big concerns about economic growth. And I think the trade-off between taking these measures which could hurt the economy in the short term at least, that calculation is seen as a tricky trade-off. And that's why Rishi Sunak wants to talk about illegal migration, not legal migration. And it means that issue is even more important.
I thought that was interesting in your column because you talk about how Sunak is very comfortable to say stop the boats. He made it one of his 5 pledges at the start of the year. But when we talk about legal migration, that's the area that he's much more nervous to touch. And you say would rather avoid because he doesn't want to put a figure on it like tens of thousands like Suella Braverman is trying to do. There have been reports that he's been pushing back on Braverman when she wants to increase the criteria and make it harder for people to come here. Do you think that Sunak will be able to fudge this for a while longer? And do you think he might have to make this a priority when we get perhaps a new set of pledges next year, assuming that he meets the current ones? There are some question marks around some of those pledges.
So I think that it's interesting that he won't put a specific figure on what he thinks net migration should be at. If you read into what he has said when he's been pressed in interviews where he's quite uncomfortable, it seems to be that he says he wants to get it back to what he inherited when he became Prime Minister, which is around 500,000. Mm-hmm. Now, I think that figure sounds very big, which is probably one of the reasons he doesn't want to say out loud, I think it should be at 500,000, because I don't think you can have that conversation really until you have a grip on illegal migration. Perhaps at that point you can start to have a conversation about what the economy needs, what the plan is to reduce it. But that's part of the reluctance at the moment. And then I think there is a chance going into the next election that the Tories will try and move on this. Labour are currently backing policies that would restrict legal migration that the Tories are not backing. So this will be a dividing line that the Tories want to have over Labour, not something Labour can take points from them on. But I think you get back to illegal migration, and this is an area where even if Rishi Sunak managed to do a lot in terms of stopping the boats, he would still, I think, potentially have political pain as a result of these figures. You'll see lots of people go in the attack. There's already discomfort in the Tory party, and his pledge, which is to stop the boats, or at least not to point to by election to show it's going in the right direction. If that's not there, what does he have to say?
Let's turn to the Home Secretary personally. There was pressure on Rishi Sunak this week to launch an investigation into a recent speeding ticket and the way that she handled it within the civil service. But Rishi Sunak has decided not to launch that investigation. It seems that Suella Braverman is in the clear.
Yes. I think Suella Braverman is looking safe from that perspective. You have a situation by which this story broke in the Sunday Times and the Mail on Sunday. A story ultimately regarding a speeding fine she received when she was Attorney General. When she became Home Secretary under Liz Truss, she asked civil servants whether it was possible for the speed awareness course that she was planning to pick over the points and the fine to have that in a one-on-one setting. The civil servants refused to look into that, went to political aid, and the question was, did she break the ministerial code by asking civil servants to ultimately deal with what was a personal matter? Now, the defence is that she is a protected person as Home Secretary. You have round-the-clock security. So this is a question which is reasonable for those reasons. Now, Rishi Sunak has consulted with his independent ethics advisor and has effectively said that he's been advised that it doesn't really merit further investigation. He does not think that Suella Braverman broke the ministerial code. And I think you've seen this week how divisive Suella Braverman is as a politician, because opposition parties, some civil servants and some in her own party were quick to go in the attack. Though in her own party, I think it was more the anonymous approach. But I think generally this is a decision that is being welcomed within the Tory party, because yes, you had MPs on the right who were pretty much always backs Suella Braverman in these situations, defending her, saying it was a stitch-up. But you also had MPs in the middle of the party, MPs on the left of the party, who will admit they're not the biggest Suella fans out there, but they thought this was really a technicality and not something which is a resigning matter.
And of course, we've just seen the results of the Dominic Raab inquiry. Was there any element here of Rishi Sunak sitting back and thinking, gosh, if I do launch an investigation into this, if I do open up this can of worms, it brings the threshold even further down as to what I might have to investigate? And at that point, it almost seems like a free-for-all.
Yeah, I think there is a factor. You have Rishi Sunak saying in his first speech, I will lead a government of integrity. But there comes a point which is, well, does that mean every single time the opposition parties say, oh, you said you'd lead the government of integrity, and this doesn't follow this point here, he then has to spark an inquiry? So I think it was an important decision in the sense of there is a creeping concern in the Tory party that some MPs will call it the blob, but civil servants, they feel would rather have a Labour government, and they feel the Dominic Raab ruling made it probably more likely we're now in an environment where other secretaries of state can find themselves in the firing line for these reasons. So choosing not to have an inquiry, I think, has calmed some of the concerns, particularly in Cabinet, actually, about how it's all going to shake out in the future.
That's an important point, I think, that, when the opposition party says, well, you're not holding yourself to integrity, they probably feel that way about a lot of areas of policy, a lot of decision-making. It would be difficult to act every single time. Lastly, Katie, I want to come on to Boris Johnson, who is back again. Partygate is back again. Talk us through it.
Yeah, I think we're in a Groundhog Day when it comes to Boris Johnson and COVID and Partygate and rules.
We're just on a loop.
Yeah. The show is back in town.
Yeah.
Now,
get your tickets now.
This is not even to do with the Privileges Committee. The Privileges Committee, we are expecting to have its finding soon, probably in the next couple of weeks, in terms of whether Boris Johnson misled Parliament on Partygate. But this is a whole new thing in the sense that Boris Johnson is having his legal fees paid by the taxpayer, by the government, taxpayer, and as a result, the Cabinet Office appointed lawyers. Now, he, as ahead of the COVID inquiry, he passed over lots of details for preparing the evidence, so diaries and so forth. And figures in the Cabinet Office saw in the diaries visits to Chequers, potentially also the number 10 flat, which they thought looked as though they were beyond the rules. So the number of people going, family members, and therefore these figures say that under the Civil Service Code, they had to flag that, so they flagged it to officials, and the Cabinet Office referred it to the police. Now, That has created a massive row in many different directions. You have Boris Johnson, or at least friends of Boris Johnson, saying he could sue the government. You have the COVID inquiry saying, why haven't we had access to some of these things that we need for our inquiry?
Supposedly they have everything, and it's clear they don't.
More threatening to sue. And then you also have Rishi Sunak in all this, because some allies of Boris Johnson are saying, we think the Prime Minister is complicit. Ministers had a role in signing this off going to the police, something the Cabinet Office firmly denies. But it just shows you, I think, the level of bad blood spilling in lots of different directions. So I think, I suppose, what does this all mean in terms of what we're going to be seeing and what's going to be happening in politics? Well, it means that even if Boris Johnson is cleared on Privileges Committee, he potentially has another partygate issue hanging over him. And I think it shows how the COVID inquiry could be pretty poisonous and tricky for the Tory party as a whole, when you think in the run-up to an election, the currently an evidence side of it. And then finally, what does it mean for Rishi Sunak? There's been some excited talk of letters could go in. I would take that with a pinch of salt, the idea we are heading to another political leader being ousted. Of course, lots of things happen in British politics, but it is a small group for now of Boris Johnson loyalists who are pretty unhappy and they don't think Rishi Sunak has been sufficiently loyal to him. The vast majority of MPs on the WhatsApp groups or in conversations are saying, calm down everyone, let's just stay united. What are you actually accusing people of? But I do think Rishi Sunak has a bit of a problem at the moment, in the sense that it might be coverage, it might be the MPs, but the past 2 weeks have felt a little bit loose in terms of some cabinet ministers speaking out with speeches, some Tory MPs kind of freelancing with their views on policy, and they get a lot of attention because Rishi Sunak's government isn't saying as much. And altogether, when you combine it today, these anonymous briefings about how some Boris Johnson MPs are going to obstruct Rishi Sunak's premiership, is just creating a very messy picture of the Tory party, which I think is the last thing Rishi Sunak needs if he is going to have a chance of turning things around.
I am still fascinated by and infuriated by Partygate, but I think I'm probably one of 3 people in the UK that still feels that way. What about the Tory party? I mean, when Partygate resurfaces, when Boris Johnson resurfaces like this, what are the conversations happening inside the Tory party over it? Presumably, some people want to come out and defend the former Prime Minister. Other people just want to move on from this completely. Of course, Rishi Sunak himself got a fine for COVID breaches of the rules. So surely for a lot of people, it's in their best interest just to move on.
I think the vast sense in the Tory party is that they all want to move on. A large part of the reason Boris Johnson is not Prime Minister was the sense of wanting to move on. There were MPs who effectively did like Boris Johnson as a Prime Minister. They supported him, but it felt as though they could never shake themselves free of this rolling story and scandal. So I think what these stories do is, yes, there are some people who are defensive of Boris Johnson that obviously think Rishi Sunak should take a firmer line on defending Boris Johnson. And also lots of people saying, why are we still talking about Partygate in a week of inflation? Look at those net migration figures. There are bigger issues out there. But what I think it all does do is just confirm that sense amongst a majority of Tory MPs that they don't want to go back to the Boris Johnson days.
Katie, thanks for joining me. It's been a big week for economics too. The latest immigration figures came out today and inflation numbers earlier this week. To give us a briefing, I'm joined by our data editor, Michael Simmons. Michael, the net migration figures are out this morning. Everyone has been anticipating these figures, and they are higher than they were last year, but significantly lower than what we were told they were going to be.
Yes, so estimates that came from the CPS think tank and also were briefed out by the Home Office suggested that at their very lowest they were going to be 700,000, and some people said that they could even go as high as 1 million. But the net figure released today by the ONS was 606,000, which is significantly lower than what was expected. Now, part of this is to do with changes in the ONS's methodology, but I think there was definitely still, high balling in these estimates, and the figure, has surprised everyone. And then a lot of the increase within that figure is actually accounted for by Ukrainian refugees and also Hong Kong BNO passport holders. So I think that today's news really changes the narrative on migration, where we've been going as a rising and rising thing. The ONS actually say themselves that in the last few quarters, the kind of growth has slowed. So it may be that the spikes in migration are a temporary factor of some of the humanitarian crises we've been going through.
Now, I don't think it should be surprising that it is the refugee figures, the humanitarian route, that has led to quite a big jump. And we should say student numbers are also going up, Tier 2 workers are also going up, but it does seem like the refugee figures have had a really big impact here. I don't think that should be surprising, given the fact that the UK opened its doors last year and people were very happy to do so. But you're right about the narrative, Michael. Over the past few weeks, we haven't even been talking about the refugees. It's been all focused on the students.
Yep, it's been focused on the students because the students are the largest group, and student visas certainly have increased, as well as the number of dependents that are coming on student visas has been going up over the years, and that's partly why the government announced sort of actions to kind of try and curb that. But the student numbers as a proportion of all non-EU immigration have actually gone down from, I think it was about 49% to 37% of the total net immigration.
47% to 39%.
Thank you, yeah. So even then, it looks like that the students are coming, they're staying for a short time, and there's even evidence in the data that they're starting to leave. So it seems sort of less of a problem, if you call it a problem, of that part of the kind of immigrant group. It's also worth saying, though, obviously they're still higher than historic trends, but the data actually also showed that they seem to be starting to kind of leave faster. Students don't all come here and then want to stay here forever. You know, some of them will do their course and then go back. So we could see that this number kind of being at a peak. What certainly has been true in the narrative before the release, and has been confirmed by the release though, is the change in where people come from and into the UK. You know, historically that's because of our membership of the European Union, it's predominantly been people from the EU. But now, people coming here from the EU, there was actually a net outflow. So the net immigration figure is entirely now made up basically of non-EU migrants, and that's what's kind of hit record highs. So now our top visa groups are Indians, Nigerians, Chinese. So that's the real change in the kind of immigration narrative.
Yeah, and it's a big difference, one that politicians can't be terribly surprised by. When Boris Johnson and Priti Patel changed the immigration policy back in 2020, they designed the system so it would be easier for migrants coming from outside of the EU to come here. There wasn't free movement for anybody anymore, but they did lower the thresholds for that starting salary. They did extend the graduate scheme so students could stay here and look for a Tier 2 job. You know, the system has been changed by Tories. It puts politicians today in a slightly difficult position because, of course, it is their fellow colleagues who so recently changed the scenario. If you don't like it, you still have to take some responsibility for it.
Yeah, I mean, if Brexit, we say, was about taking back control, the government has taken back control of its borders, of the immigration system, but it has decided for certain groups at least, turn on the taps. And there are good economic reasons for this. We still have over 1 million vacancies in the job market. A huge proportion of the increase in worker visas is for people working in the NHS and social care.
That is up by 171%.
Exactly right.
It's difficult to criticize that given our situation.
Yep. So these are jobs that need to be filled in. So the government cannot really claim that this is something they don't have control over. There's an economic case for migration that they have chosen to accept. Now, of course, people might say there are, cultural reasons why you still want to curb this number, but it's a balance between that and the economics. And clearly the government is going with the economic argument for, letting more and more workers into the economy.
While I have you here, Michael, we also have some big inflation data out this week. The April figures were really a key moment because the Bank of England, broadly speaking, the consensus was saying once we get to spring, that is when the inflation rate is going to start to fall dramatically. Of course, we've heard this before and it hasn't fallen. We've been in double digits, but in April, we did see that headline figure fall to a rate of 8.7%, down from 10.1%. However, core inflation, which excludes the volatile stuff, energy, food, that's actually up.
Yeah, so that's what's really been surprising about the inflation figure. As you say, everyone knew that we were going to see our first big fall in the headline figure, and that's because the energy price rises that happened this time last year have sort of fallen out of the comparison period, so prices are not that high relative to what they were a year ago. But core inflation, as you say, which excludes food, alcohol, energy prices, tobacco, that's actually gone up to a 30-year high. I don't think it's been as high as this since 1992. And that shows really that inflation at the centre of Britain's economy that's not so much affected by imports and exports is still going up. So with it being nearly 7%, it looks harder and harder to see how Rishi Sunak is going to get it down to his target of halving it this year, because it will still go down as energy prices fall out, but it's not going to go lower than core inflation. It can't.
Well, this is what's so worrying, is that it does seem that some of that inflation around, say, core goods and around services is becoming embedded into the system. A grim point to end on, but an important one too. Michael, thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
And finally, Jeremy Clarke, the Spectator's low-life columnist for 23 years, has sadly passed away. Readers will be well aware of his battle with cancer. He spent the last years of his life in Provence, France, with his wife, Catriona. His many friends at the Spectator miss him dearly. One of them, our columnist Rod Liddle, joins me now. Rod, you write a beautiful tribute to Jeremy Clarke in this week's magazine. His writing, you say, was always the truth. Why do you think that was so important?
He was very, very different to the rest of us as journalists. There was no artifice in the way he wrote. He didn't exaggerate for effect. He didn't use understatement for effect. He really called it precisely as he saw it, and in a way, in an interesting way, kind of in a rather wide-eyed way. It was always, everything was a revelation to him, and it didn't matter if something contradicted with his own personal political beliefs or his own philosophy, or it was something which might annoy the public if he mentioned it. He just didn't intercede with what he actually put down on paper. And I think that's why, aside from obviously the fact that he did work hard at his writing, I think that's why it endured so brilliantly and people loved it so much, because it was unfiltered, perfectly unfiltered. People sometimes used to say to me, Rod Liddle, you're the second column I turn to every week in The Spectator. Normally when I hear things like that, I want to strangle whoever it is who's the first column they turn to in The Spectator. It was always Jeremy, always.
Yep. Rod, you and Jeremy started at The Spectator at roughly the same time. You were friends for many years. What was it like when you first met him, and what was it like joining as columnists together?
It was interesting. I mean, theoretically, we should have been friends right from the off. But, at our class of society, I'm afraid football tribalism is rather important. Jezza was a Hammer, a West Ham supporter, and I'm Millwall, and there is no greater enmity on earth than between those two. But nonetheless, that in a way became a kind of cement for our friendship, because we both supported clubs who the other could grudgingly accept were proper working class football clubs. And there we were, thrown into this rather, it's a different place, The Spectator today. It's rather more meritocratic. When Jezza and I started working there, almost everyone was a fucking duchess. It was remarkable. It was a very, very high-born atmosphere where everyone had been to private school and they were all related to William the Conqueror. So it was
a totally different world.
Yeah, a totally different world. But the interesting thing in a way is that while I was perfectly capable of being very chippy about this, and Jezza always thought of me as a hardline socialist, which probably gives you an indication as to where he stood on the political spectrum. But while I could get quite chippy about the high-born atmosphere of The Spectator, it didn't bother him one bit, really. He knew he wasn't part of it, which is why I guess in the early years we cleaved together quite a lot. There was no grudge. He was, I think, in truth, a proper working class Tory, of the old school, who actually quite liked your toffs, quite liked the toffs, but didn't have much time for the middle class. I think that's probably where Jeremy would be located.
You write in your tribute that you had some riotously drunken evenings together. Can you tell us about any of them?
Oh, get stuffed. No, they remain with us. Probably actually a lot fewer than we should have had, because after a while, both of us lived a very, very long way away from London. So our chances to meet up, we would always, at various Spectator bashes, we would always hang out together.
You do write, though, that he came to your wedding, wrote a lovely piece about it for the magazine, and he was there at your daughter's christening. He sounds like he was a very committed friend.
In those early days, yes. I mean, we didn't so much grow apart as just moved apart in later years. But yeah, in those early years, yes, he was. We always, whenever there was a Spectator do, I always gravitated to Jeremy and vice versa. Even when, on one notable occasion, he was at a Spectator bash in about 2006 or 7, and I saw this very tall black man there, and Spectator dues back in 2006-7 were whiter than a Ku Klux Klan dinner dance, mate, I'm telling you. And there was this very, very tall black man there who I recognised immediately as being Cass Pennant, who was the leader of West Ham's intercity firm hooligan team, and who was there rubbing shoulders with the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Chancellor of the Exchequer at Jez's behest. And he was great. And Cass is actually a very, very good bloke and a very entertaining man to be around. But at bashes like that, we'd always hang out together, I suppose.
You write that you would chew the fat and spit it out. And this is something I think readers of Jeremy's column will really want to know. Did he talk like he wrote? And what did he like to talk about?
I think to a great degree in those early days when I knew him, I don't think he was very happy. In that, he was always desperately worried about his family, always hoping that they would be able to get their lives on track to do the right thing. And it was only later, I think, when he found the lovely Catriona that he became kind of anchored and a much happier and contented human being, which ironically coincided, of course, with that horrible illness, which he battled for 10 years, and did so again in that same way, without fury or anger, with a kind of Buddhist-like acceptance of fate, and without rancour. And even found in it beauty, whether it be the conversations with the taxi drivers or the oncologists or just local people. He could find beauty in that, and that's writing of an extraordinarily high degree,
Finally, Rod, you say that Jeremy was at points unsettled, as you just said there, sometimes angered and often pissed. But how do you think he changed over the years?
Yeah, I think he changed a lot. I think we didn't see very much of each other in the last few years. I think, but I do know, and you can tell from his writing that he was, immensely cheered by his grandkids and loved being with them, and of course he adored Catriona and had a very, very happy life there. I think, in a way, the tragedy, of course, of Jeremy is that he's not rich and famous. He should be. He's a very, very, very good writer, but I don't think he was ever an editor's writer, because he didn't really care what anyone else thought. He just wrote what he believed in, and I don't think he was a He wouldn't be able to say things for mass consumption simply to please the masses. It was just an honesty that was always there. And that is what made him such a superb writer, and also probably what kept him skint for most of his life.
Well, our current editor has written about how Jeremy would file word perfect, one of the only columnists and writers truly untouched. Rod, you say that you will miss him and you will miss his writing, and I think coming from you, that is the highest compliment. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Kate. Cheers.
That's it for this week. Once again, thank you to Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management for sponsoring the week in 60 Minutes. Canaccord will provide you with the expertise you need to build your wealth with confidence. Visit kendowealth.com for more information. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.